So, picture this. You're sitting in your office, and all of a sudden your boss starts blowing up at two of your colleagues. Except, it's not about who did or didn't file that tax report. No, it's about the only thing that really matters in life. Dungeons and Dragons. And, to make matters worse, it turns out your boss is a crazy psycho stalker. Who could have guessed? Well, certainly not the OP of today's story, nor the players at their table. So let's roll for initiative and witness one hot mess of a story. People can get weirdly attached to their characters, but it takes a special kind of person to take it to the point of threats and verbal assault, stalking, and sabotage. I had been DMing a game for some work friends, as a way to introduce some of them to the game alongside some long-term players, so that the game would not only flow a little easier, but the requirement for me as a DM to teach them the game as a base level would be alleviated somewhat, so I could concentrate on actually DMing. Now, some will say DMing for workmates is not always a good idea, as it can lead to some in-real-life issues if things don't go so well. In 20 plus years of tabletop role-playing games as both a DM and a player, I really had never had this issue, beyond some newfound and failed personal romantic relationships that led to some minor issue and some weirdness when in-character romance led to confusion off the table. This was one of those times. The game, in and of itself, was nothing really to write home about. A basic homebrew setup set on the Sword Coast with some basic plagiarism from Neverwinter, with a little Assassin's Creed and Legacy of Kain for flavor. Nothing too spicy, but with enough flavor to keep the veterans interested while being flexible enough for me as a DM to make it easily digestible for the fresh players. It all rather came to a head a little after one of our players, a pretty generic tiefling warlock, Becca, with a weird flair for the dramatic that I wanted to encourage, got involved in a romantic tryst with one of my established players, a vengeance paladin, George, who was just on the verge of becoming an oathbreaker after finding out that the object of his vengeful crusade had been a fabrication of his own damaged mind, and that he had been the one to do the rather dastardly deed that put him on this path during an extended weekend of drunken debauchery brought about from some spiked ale and a run-in with his emotionally abusive father. It was a weird backstory, a tad grim-dark and edgy, but it seemed interesting at the time, so I went with it. This tied in quite well with our little warlock, who had a habit of mixing any and all wild and unusual herbs and random monster bits into concoctions that she would sell in the town. For fun, we rolled on a random effects list, all non-lethal, with a D100 to see what the potions did, and it turned out that this leaned pretty well with her backstory and patronage to a fey trickster. At this point, the story was somewhat focused on the paladin and his present, ongoing self-loathing, and the party was debating if George was going to break his oath or seek out those that had spiked his drink back in his hometown. Now, I know that the party were pretty much expecting me to trope this hell and have the warlock be the one that spiked the drink, etc., but I'm not that kind of DM, and I enjoy taking expectations like this and tossing them to the wind. But this one had legs, and I kind of wanted it to be more linked to the warlock's patron rather than her as an individual. Sessions passed, and we ended up venturing into the Fey realm to confront the definitely not summoner lady and her people, which led to the paladin taking a level in warlock himself, and focusing his vengeance on those that had actually spiked him rather than the lady herself, and form a much closer bond with the warlock, who in turn started to focus more towards a hexblade build. While the party druid and cleric respectively took bets on when the pair would hook up, and the other new player, a fighter obsessed with rats, as rodents of unusual size and the disposal of them via incredible feats of violence were pretty much the cornerstone of his own backstory, sought out new and unusual weapons of rodent destruction. Becca and George bonded quite a bit, so much so that it started to spill over in real life, and the pair kinda started dating. I noted with both of them that although I had no issues with this both in character and out of character, if it caused issues at the table for whatever reason, I would put my foot down as DM and either remove one or both of them from the game. For a while, all was well. There were no real issues until the Warlocks player got promoted in work. As our new team leader in real life, things started off brilliantly, with her being able to set timetables so that we, her, the fighter, and myself, would have time off on Saturday to play, and could work Sundays, and discuss the previous night's game in our downtime. It was really a dream come true in many respects, at least until the fighter, Sebastian, caused a bit of a ruckus during Becca's and George's RP, when he headed downstairs after a fade to black moment, and I turned my attention to the rest of the table while they RP'd. Snuggles. Seb, as I pointed out, had a bit of an obsession with rodents, so much so that he had developed an uncanny ability, lucky perception rolls, to always know when the building was infested, and took it upon himself to deal with any scurrying pets, for a nominal fee. This had been a fun way to earn some small coin, and the player had really taken to it, even considering ranger levels, so he could lean into it harder. As he was a new player, this enthusiasm had to be encouraged, and thus, with Snuggle Time ongoing, he and the other player opted to head to the basement and play whack-a-mole with the local rodent population for fun and profit. This led to them finding out that the former owner of the inn had at one stage been an adventurer himself, and some low-level magic items had been stashed. One of which was a pretty nifty +1 rapier and +1 buckler, which, after some small debate, it was agreed that the fighter should definitely keep. The next day, in real life, was a little odd, as the Warlock player seemed a lot sharper than normal and pretty much kept to herself. Nonetheless, the week passed, and everything seemed normal until the fighter player found himself scheduled to work on game night. The Warlock player offered her apology, and it seemed like this was an oversight, and said that she would go out of her way to make sure that this wouldn't happen again. Game night came around, and with no fighter player to take part, he had agreed, at work, to simply have his character be so exhausted by the prior night's mini-adventure that he would simply pay for another night at the inn and stay in bed, while we hunted the town for our paladin's antagonists, or some form of information relating to similar incidents. It was at this time that Becca piped up and noted that it would be a shame to leave the sleeping fighter's new shiny toys behind, when George could use them just as well, or better, if we ran into trouble. I nixed this idea pretty hard and advised that he was attuning to them, and that was clearly why he was so tired. And even if they could take them from the sleeping fighter, I would have to ask the player if this was okay, as it had been agreed by those that found them that the fighter should have them. She seemed okay with this at the time, so I let it pass in spite of the blatant red flag. Things went fairly smoothly, and once again the party, after a quick chat with the local guard and some sleuthing, I dropped a plot hook that would lead them out of the town to a local distillery. Again, following the day, the Warlock player seemed oddly distracted and didn't want to discuss the prior night's game, so I filled in the fighter on what happened, and he seemed pretty hyped to test out his new toys on the distillery, as it was bound to have rats. The week passes, and once again the fighter found himself scheduled to work on game night. As I didn't want to move the game on without him, I canceled the session and opted to simply have the lads over for a drink and some pizza, with the declined offer for a one-shot as they wanted to stay focused on the game in hand. The Warlock player opted to not come, so we had a fairly silly night of Mario Kart and beer. It got to about 11 or 12, and I got chatted properly with my longtime table buddy and present paladin player about the game. He confessed that he had mentioned being a bit miffed on missing out on the rat catching and a chance of a magical weapon, and had talked to the Warlock player about it during their date night. She had seemed upset that he had missed out because of Snuggle Time, and blamed herself for the RP bed-based distraction. He had shrugged it off as that's just D&D, and told her that more toys were bound to turn up. It wasn't until an hour or so later that we put two and two together. This led to a bit of a drunk dial and a bit of a blowout between them, when she confessed to intentionally scheduling the fighter away from the table so that the paladin could get the magical weapons, and that she was going to bring them back when I was more fair. The following day in work was less than fun, with the Warlock player having a go at me for ruining her relationship and warning me that if I talked about her behind her back, that I would find myself scheduled on every Saturday from this point on. I countered with, well, you will have a hard time playing the game without a DM, which seemed to shut down the threat pretty darn quickly. Saturday came, and lo and behold, everyone was free to play. The scheduling issue seemingly resolved, and we got to rolling dice. Again, a few weeks, things went well. Magic items did in fact turn up, and a story was in fact forthcoming. What also happened is that the in-game snuggle time was pretty much off the table, as the Paladin, now significantly more wary of the in-real-life power games that his new bow was capable of, opted to keep the party together rather than engage in tabletop randiness. The Warlock was less than happy and took to sulking in real life and only paying lip service to the game before eventually opting to retire her character fully and leave the table. One would think that's where the story ends. Sadly, not. With no risk of tabletop overspill, the Paladin player and former Warlock continued to date, and work-based D&D chats continued without the potential fallout, and with a keen interest regarding the retired Becca and George's in-character long-distance love life, which was still more or less now an established character point due to the now combined backstory elements. This was fine, until mention of any form of Paladin-based flirting or charisma-based interactions were mentioned. He flirted with a barmaid for information in character, nothing more, and I once again found myself working a Saturday, and game night being postponed. When that failed to deter the Paladin from having an in-character life once again, the fighter found himself on an odd schedule, and unable to play. It was especially odd because after the first incident, we had opted to keep any events regarding the game, and more specifically the Paladin, well out of earshot. Through luck, or coincidence, we were able to get around the table together, and get a game in, with some key story events that there is no way that our former Warlock could possibly know about, that involved the forswearing of the Paladin's firstborn to his Fey patron, and passing an off-the-cuff comment regarding when they are going to do it, as he would have to ask the missus, implying that he was going to procreate with the patron herself to fulfill the bargain. Sunday was hell. Our former Warlock was furious that I would allow such a thing to happen when I knew the Paladin and her were still in a relationship in-game, and that I had to change it immediately, or she would again make sure that I was working every Saturday, as it no longer mattered to her as she was no longer playing. I simply said I would move to another day, and that she had no say in what happened at my table. She was less than pleased. I worked the next 3 Saturdays, and moved the game to a Sunday or Friday respectively, DMPCing the fighter, under his request, when he couldn't make the game that night. Again, key events that there is no possible way she could know about kept cropping up in the form of snide remarks and curt comments. I presumed that the Paladin had been letting slip, or that somebody had said something, but all players at the table swore that they had said nothing. It took about 2 months to find out that she was accessing the Paladin's Google Drive and reading his notes. We only found out when he changed his phone and had to reset his Google password, a password I should point out that he had never shared with our former Warlock. This led to a full-on fit in work when she demanded to know what happened in-game. When I refused to answer, she called over our Paladin and demanded that he tell her. He refused, pulled her on accessing his Google Drive, and, after a bit of a screaming match in her office, apparently dumped her there and then, as he couldn't trust her. This doubles down when both the fighter and I requested a team transfer due to internal differences and toxic work environment, which, thanks to her little fit, was now office public knowledge. The game suspended for a week or 2, while the fighter and myself moved to another team and got our schedules aligned, and the game carried on from that point as normal. Work did get a little rough as I was being badmouthed quite aggressively But that ended when the fighter and I started working from home thanks to the plague times, and the game moved to Discord. Suffice to say, Snuggle Time is now off my table between players. As for the former Warlock player, boyfriend lost. D&D lost. Respect at work lost. Friends and colleagues lost. Due to her blow-up at work, she also lost her respect and chances of leading additional teams, as she blew up in the office. She has 2 strikes now against her from our reports of toxic workplace-based behavior and verbal assault to employees, which saw her lose her position as team lead when the lockdown happened, and is unlikely to get it back due to those reports. End post. I've gotta say, D&D in the workplace, not the worst of things that can happen. The problem is when you start trying to also date your boss, who's also a player at the table, and that can get really messy fast. And as a result, there were a lot of signs that they should have tried to resolve this issue earlier, maybe try to remove her from the game or, talk with her about her actions. But based on what happened and the fact that she did that at the office, I don't think that those would have fixed the issues. So here's what I personally would have done. And just as a disclosure, I am in a very relatively upper level within my current company and have a little bit of insight as to what you would do in a situation like this as an employee. In short, you want to go to HR. That's what they're there for. In fact, as she became their boss, she should have already gone to HR and let them know that, hey, we were playing Dungeons and Dragons outside of work time, because they may have actually nixed that idea if they knew her personality well. But yeah, the moment she started blackmailing them about which days they would and wouldn't be working and effectively punishing them for that, that would have been a straight to HR moment for me. Now, granted, I don't know what country they're in, so they may have different laws there. Maybe HR departments don't really exist where they live. I don't know. But at least in the US, if your boss is doing anything like that to you, not even for D&D or something like that, if you're seeing yourself getting punished for something that is outside of work by your boss, go to HR. That's what they're there for. Just my 2 cents on that subject. Anyhow, that's it for today's story. As always, if you want to join my inn and be one of the patrons that show up, all you got to do is head to the Patreon link in the description and take a look into the various tiers to see what is available. If you liked the video, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and smash that like button as well just to help out with the YouTube algorithm. Anyhow, while you wait for my future videos, here are a few other videos from my channel that you can check out in the meantime.